Amazing. Recording in progress. So welcome to today's Knowledge Thirsty Thursday. My name is Hanako. I use they, them pronouns, and I will be your host for the next hour. So today we're going to be talking about sex work in the context of labor rights. So the work part of this and understanding the item, what am I trying to say? Understanding the concept of labor and work and workers' rights. So I am presenting from Mohkinstis, which is where the Elbow and the Bow River meet, so colonially known as Calgary. This land has been taken care of, and the labor of love has been put into this land by the Siksika Confederacy, the Niitsitapi, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, Tsuut'ina Nation, the Iahe Nakota nations of Wesley Chiniki and Bearspaw, as well as Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. When we're talking about rights and labor and exploitation, I want to remind everyone of where we're currently physically residing, the work that we do, the work that has been done, and what does labor look like, who is afforded access to labor conditions, who is denied rights, and who is most impacted disproportionately by working exploitation, that kind of thing. So, in the spirit of Dolly Part 10, just going to go over our agenda a little bit. So we're going to talk about what is work, what are labor rights, some of the gaps in conversation surrounding sex work right now in terms of how we are conceptualizing it, how we discuss it. And then I want to delve in a little bit into the conversation around exploitation and trafficking, because those often come up in conversations about sex work. My goal for this presentation, caveat, if I'm talking too quickly, please let me know. I have a really bad habit of getting into a topic and just, so feel free to just gently in the chat be like, please slow down, and I will go back, repeat, and I'll be mindful from now on anyways. So my goal for this presentation is to just shift the framework from talking about like sex workers' rights from like the sex work part and going into the labor rights. So sex work isn't really all that unique from other forms of work and labor, but it is unique in the way that it is criminalized, conceptualized, and perceived. So as Dolly Parton said, working 9 to 5. What is work? So depending on who you talk to, work can be defined in a huge variety of ways, but essentially it's the doing of something or providing of something to accomplish something and being provided a thing in exchange for that. And so here I just have, we do things for money to then access resources, right? So something to consider is who is in control of this middle part of the screen, who is in control of the money that we are given. Sometimes we skip the step of money. Sometimes we do work for shelter, food, water, medication, enjoyment, all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of the basis, just so we're all on the same page there. So I want to talk a little bit about the arguments against sex work. And a reason I want to do this is because when we look at it from a framework of labor rights, we can see that these arguments aren't unique to sex work. They're critiques of working conditions, and that is an important thing. However, uniquely pointing out sex work is a disservice and is misplaced. So before we start, I should define sex work. So sex work is the exchange of a sexual service for money, goods, other services. That's it, right? So that could be providing a sexual service in exchange for money, providing sexual photos in exchange for food. These are forms of sex work. I do not tell someone, it's up to people to decide if they're doing sex work, right? Like if they define their experience as sex work. Some people may exchange sex or sexual services for something else and not consider themselves sex workers, and that is okay. It is not up to me or anyone to tell them what they are doing is or is not sex work, but that is kind of the conceptualization. And so at SafeLink Alberta and as Shift, we are rights-based, meaning that we support sex worker rights, and workers' rights is kind of where I'm going with this. And so that also includes being pro-decriminalization of sex work. This means removing legislative barriers, removing the criminal background, the criminal context that impacts sex workers. If you want to know more in depth about that, we have our 102 workshop that you can attend for kind of details. But if you have questions about it in the meantime, I'm happy to answer it. So we are pro sex worker rights, we are pro decriminalization. And so some of the arguments against this include, I'm going to quote here, that sex workers are inherently coerced by the socioeconomic coercion that pushes the most vulnerable women and girls into prostitution. So that's a quote. And here I want to highlight socioeconomic coercion. So they're saying that the context of finances and social standing is what impacts and pushes people into sex work. Next argument that I'm going to quote is that human trafficking feeds a demand created by a flourishing sex industry. So saying that trafficking, the demand for sex work allows human trafficking to flourish. That is the argument created. Another is that sex workers only do the work for money. If it wasn't for the money, they wouldn't be doing sex work, right? And that nobody grows up wanting to be a sex worker. That's not anyone's dream career. And this idea that clients are all inherently violent. The reason I want to highlight some of these arguments is that if we dissect it a little bit, we can see that this is not unique to sex work, right? So for example, sex workers only do the work for the money. I believe that a lot of folks work for the money. A lot of us also, plenty of people may also have other benefits from working, whether it is personal fulfillment, whether it is community connection, whether it is pursuing a passion. Absolutely. I would like everyone to consider in your work, if you were not being paid, would you be doing the same work? Would you be doing the same amount of work? Would you be doing the same hours of work? Because we are in a society where we need to have money to access our basic needs of shelter, food, water, connection, and then pursuing pleasure and passions, working is the way that we get to that. So it is not unique to sex work that people only do it for the money. That does not make it different. That is just the nature of work. Another is, again, that kind of goes back to that first quote that I read about how sex workers are inherently coerced because of the socioeconomic context. Again, this is not unique to sex workers. Socioeconomic conditions impact the kind of work that anyone can access. There's an idea of kind of good work and bad work across labor, right? And that's an issue in itself because, work is work. But again, by focusing and specifically critiquing sex work, it furthers the stigma against sex workers. It further pushes sex workers aside. It further others. So, sex workers are here. Every other worker is over here. They're different. And that is not only inaccurate, but very damaging to sex workers. And to everyone, because sex workers are also our friends, family, loved ones, enemies, maybe like friends and foes. However, they're part of a community, and it's not like an us versus them and the work is everything. People are whole people. And for many of us, work is one aspect of us, but not everything, right? So I want to talk a little bit about how this anti-sex worker and prohibitionist is what we call anti-sex work kind of frameworks, how this is able to thrive and the reason why they do it. Because often what happens is the core argument that these folks will use is that sex workers are being trafficked. Whether or not they agree that all of them are or some of it are, it's exploitative, whatever. And so there's a lot of programs and a lot of ideas on how to support sex workers, and in that idea, how to support people who are being exploited or trafficked. And so what's happening is that we have this drama triangle. Now, this drama triangle is called the Cartman triangle, and it is usually used to understand like conflict among three people and how we adopt roles. I'm mostly using it as a way to just simply show the dynamics that are happening. So by framing sex workers as victims, right? As framing sex workers as people who've had no other option, their life is so hard, they don't want to be doing this work, it's only for the money. By framing it only in that way, we create a victim. And then when we have a victim, we can rescue someone, right? If we want to be a rescuer, someone needs to be rescued. And that means that someone needs to be a victim, whether that person is actually asking for your support or not. And then in order for a rescue to be able to happen, they need to be rescued from something. And so then the persecutor, think clients, think pimps, like madams, like things that people often refer to as the persecutor. So traffickers in this example, right? So when we have people who are anti-sex work, who are saying that, you know, it's all exploitation, it's all trafficking, we create a rescuer who can then rescue the victim that they've created, conceptualize. Whether these folks would self-identify as victims, whether they see their experience as being victimized or not, we're creating this idea of victim for this whole community. And same with the persecutor, the bad guy, if you so to speak. Clients, third party is what we refer to as like a person who like facilitates sex work as like middleman kind of thing, but those people are also persecuted as being traffickers and all this kind of stuff. And so I want to keep this in mind because it's going to come up a little bit when talking about exploitation and trafficking in my next slides here. But here I've got a bit of a diagram that kind of shows some of the overlap. And I like this diagram because it specifically teases out exploitation from sex work and human trafficking and shows that there is labor exploitation in sex work. Often what we're talking about when we refer to exploitation in sex work is working conditions. And so I want to talk a little bit about how some of these overlaps could be understood. So we have sex work, we have exploitation, migration, mobility, meaning moving from one place to another or being mobile, not staying in one place. So we know what sex work is. And so when we go into the red overlap here, if we imagine, pardon me, let me just look over here. For the red overlap, imagine that someone works at a escort agency, like a brothel or a body house, and the manager is extracting very high rent from their staff, right? Or forcing them to serve clients that the worker doesn't actually want to serve. That would be exploitative. That person is taking an unfair share of money for work being done. And there is like using the power as a manager or as a boss or a power of authority to manipulate someone's work. That is exploitative. So that could be in the red zone, sure, but that's also labor exploitation. In the green under here, so this is where we have exploitation and mobility. Oh, sorry, actually pin in that, I apologize. We're gonna go to the blue overlap here. So this is where we have sex workers and migration mobility. The reason this is highlighted is often in frameworks or like understandings of trafficking, people assume that if someone is being moved around and doing sex work, that they're being trafficked, right? However, lots of folks do touring in the same way that Taylor Swift is touring right now. She's not being trafficked as far as I know, but she's moving her work from place to place to access different clientele and to support different people. Sex workers can do the same thing. So and also like perhaps people are coming to Canada from a separate country to work here. That's also sex work. That's just mobile sex work, migrant and immigrant sex workers. That is not, trafficking is not even in that circle, right? I want to point out that we have this human trafficking bit. The way that this is conceptualized is slightly different than how we as an agency in our trainings conceptualize trafficking. So here they're saying that when exploitation is paired with movement, transport, migration, that this creates the conditions for human trafficking. At SafeLink Alberta, when we give our trainings, we talk about how trafficking has action, means, and purpose. So those three conditions are what is necessary to consider something as trafficking. So in our definition, or the definition that we use that is commonly used by different agencies and organizations, migration mobility is not a necessary factor in human trafficking. It could be like someone can be trafficked within one city, within one spot in isolation. So this kind of conceptualizes some of these things. And what it also does is that it shows that trafficking is not that easy to define. Human trafficking has, even among people who are supportive of sex work and who understand that trafficking is a whole different phenomenon, even among us, the definition changes. And this is an issue because if it's not easy to define, if we're not working from one definition, if we don't understand what we're talking about, it means if it's not meaning one thing, it can mean anything. And this is where we then go into the umbrella and go, well, this sex worker is being trafficked and they, you know what I mean? Sorry, I am kind of rambling now. Let me know if I need to stop and take a breather. If I have any questions about these kind of like ideas, this is just kind of like a way to root us in the next little bit. So why do we keep talking about trafficking? So I just talked about how trafficking is hard to define, how the definition there is a little different. Because there are some questions just to think about. And so if you want to either like like unmute or put in a chat like to me or Eddie about any of these questions. Let me know, but it's also a thing to self-reflect on. So who comes to mind when we say trafficking? Whether that's about people being trafficked or doing the trafficking, what is the image that we're conjuring up? And what are the situations that we're thinking of? What kind of trafficking comes to mind? Note that we're not saying, we didn't qualify trafficking as labor trafficking, organ trafficking, or sexual trafficking. We're just saying trafficking. What is labor trafficking? And what don't we know about labor trafficking? Industries that commonly see trafficking within them include farming, domestic support, landscaping, construction. And how are we addressing those? And I put a hint, this is just a little bit of sarcasm, but we're not criminalizing them. So even though trafficking is happening in these industries, we are not criminalizing them in the way that sex work is. The reason this is an important point is because often an argument to keep the criminalization of sex work is that it protects sex workers and that trafficking is so prevalent, pardon me, so prevalent in this industry that criminalization supports them. However, we're not doing that for these other industries because it's not actually helpful. Another thing to consider is who is overrepresented in the industries like farming, domestic support, landscaping, where exploitation is common. It is often folks with different documentation who are living here. It's often racialized folks, often poor folks. And that's something to consider, is the social context of this as well. And this last point is who is to blame for trafficking. And the reason this is coming up is because to kind of bring us back to who comes to mind when we're saying trafficking, what is the image that we have of a trafficker? In addition to that quote that I read back at the prohibitionist argument, that trafficking can exist because of a flourishing sex industry, that is what is to blame for trafficking. Kind of like the demand for sex is what is fueling trafficking. But when we consider it this way, if we're blaming clients, let's say, we're blaming the demand for sex trafficking, for human trafficking. And I'm using this definition very broadly in the way that prohibitionists use it, just to clarify. Let's say that we're blaming clients. It is not people who eat wheat and fruit and vegetables who are to blame for the trafficking of undocumented workers on farmland. The demand for wheat and food in general is not fueling trafficking. It is not the cause of trafficking. And does placing blame on individuals really serve anyone? Like, what happens when we blame individuals in this context? By putting blame on a community of people, like people accessing certain services, whether that is domestic support, landscaping, or sex work, an attempt to criminalize them, the idea is that they won't do that thing, but that demand is not going away. Another thing to note is that trafficking as a conversation piece, as an element in this kind of moral panic, kind of started off in the late 1800s. And it was fueled by concerns of specifically white women being trafficked by racialized men, and specifically Black men. And because socially, we moved on from being able to like express this racist rhetoric of like, this person is dangerous for this person. Moving away from that, we then adopt this language of trafficking when it replaces this idea of fear of white women being trafficked by racialized men. Because we can't say it like that anymore. That's racist. And so the strategy of folks who are prohibitionists, or something we could consider, I can't know people's intent. However, the effect of it is that trafficking has become a stand-in for that. Another thing is that when people bring up trafficking, it is a difficult idea, or it is difficult to question the idea of trafficking, because again, whatever definition that we're all working from, which we talked about, is very different, which then impacts how we can work with it. But whatever we're doing, we can agree that trafficking is bad. Like, no one, I believe it'd be very hard to find someone who is like, trafficking is a good thing. Like, that's not a conversation piece. And so when someone says they're anti-trafficking, how do you combat that idea? It is really difficult to then challenge that idea, because of course trafficking is bad. Of course this is bad. What you're saying is a bad thing. Again, because trafficking can mean anything. What also happens then is that we've shifted from protecting whiteness, right? White women remaining pure. We've shifted from protecting that purity idea to saving women and children. When we Google human trafficking victims, it is overwhelmingly, the images is women and children. It has shifted. So now we have back to that triangle, the drama triangle, the rescuer and the victim, instead of being whiteness, is now women and children. The rescuer is saving these folks from the persecutor of traffickers. And again, that used to be explicitly labeled as racialized people and is now just this idea of a pimp, idea of clients, idea of all this. Pardon me. And it's saviorism is what it is. And so if you Google also human traffickers, overwhelmingly, you will see images of racialized men. And so this idea, although is not in the forefront of our brains anymore, it is very clear in the way that it comes out that is replicating this outdated and racist idea of saving whiteness, saving women, saving children. And then, so why do we keep talking about trafficking is because it is the conversation is just everywhere. It's become a moral panic, to the point where some prohibitionists or people who are against sex workers, who are pro-decriminalization, so prohibitionists, people who believe sex work should end as a practice. They have, some folks who fall into that ideal have said that people can self-traffic. They've said that people can be their own traffickers and that their own idea of the world is so skewed that they then become their own persecutor. Again, this means that trafficking isn't meaning anything. If someone can use this term to mean something that is completely different from how I might conceptualize it or you might conceptualize it, we're not really saying anything. So in order to actually support people, we need to say what we mean. When we're talking about trafficking, we're talking about labor exploitation. Are we talking about kidnapping? Are we talking about fraud, about wage theft? These are also terrible things, and they're specific. That means that we know what we're talking about. The focus on sex trafficking in particular is necessary for saviorism in this realm to continue. In order for the rescuer to continue to have a victim to rescue, we have to have the persecutor. We have to have the trafficker in order to have someone being trafficked that we can then rescue. This conversation, this focus is necessary for the rescuer to exist, which is why it's perpetuated. So now, why are we talking about exploitation? So we talked about trafficking a little bit, very broad. Exploitation is also often paired with the terms, people who have been exploited or trafficked. It comes in pairs. And so I want to consider that exploitation does happen in sex work because it happens in all work. Capitalism, not to get on my soapbox here, is exploitative because for most people, life-sustaining elements such as food, water, shelter, clothing are only available and accessible and sustainable if you participate in capitalism. You don't really have a choice, or you have a choice is to not have those life-sustaining elements or to participate in selling labor for those resources. Withholding necessities of life, unless there is an exchange of labor, is exploitative. That in itself absolutely is terrible. And so again, that's not unique to sex work. That is just work. That is what it is. And so very few people in the world have absolute free choice of employment, of whether or not to participate in the selling of labor. That is not necessarily a choice that everyone gets to make. So sex work is as exploitative as the service industry, as driving, as cleaning, as childcare, as teaching, as social work. It is work. And so therefore, all the exploitation that accompanies work, sure, may apply to sex work as well. The big idea of labor exploitation can occur in escort agencies. And so this is kind of where we can draw parallels or similarities or comparisons to industries that we may have more experience with. So when we are referring to exploitation, even when paired with trafficking of sex workers, we're often alluding to working conditions. We're often referring to labor rights. So for example, escort agencies, meaning brothels, body houses is kind of like the colloquial terms for them, where, a place where sex workers can either rent a room or provide parts of their earnings to support whatever. What happens here is that independent contractors in Alberta, independent contractors of any kind, are not covered by the same labor laws as employees. So in even like a hair salon, for example, whether someone's considered an employee or a contractor, if the owner of this place wants to get away with offering fewer labor rights, they just say this person's a contractor, because then you don't have to afford the same labor rights as an employee. The rules are very different. And so what happens in industries like sex work or hairdressing, tattoo parlors, anywhere where a space can be rented to offer a service to your clients, they can be treated by an agency as contractors when the practice is actually of an employee. That is a form of exploitation. Treating someone in a different way, well, expectations are a different way in order to avoid certain working conditions, to avoid the necessity to provide working conditions, is exploitative. Again, that is not unique to sex work. It is a problem of labor rights. So it is exploitative to be treated as a contractor when your practice is as an employee. And that is a capitalism issue and a criminalization issue. Because how would a sex worker report their employer right now when that work is illegal? If you've taken our 102, or if you know a little bit of legislation, you'll know that selling sex is not illegal, but everything that kind of goes with it is. So facilitating someone else's sex work is illegal. Purchasing sex work services is illegal. Benefiting off of someone else's everything, right? That is illegal. So how would you report your employer right now when your work is illegal? What would come out of a complaint? Even if you did report that, you wouldn't get EI, you wouldn't get WCB or workers' compensation, you wouldn't get financial compensation, you might lose clients, you might lose reputation within the community, and further, it may further stigmatize you. You're already stigmatized as a sex worker from non-sex work communities, and now you're bringing this into the community that you may feel safest and connected with. Criminalization of sex work further facilitates and enables exploitation of labor to continue. This may be a little convoluted. I feel like I'm just very passionate about this, and so I might think I'm making sense, but I'm not. If people can give me like if you're okay, or actually just send me a chat if you want a little bit of clarification. It's private to me. I just want to make sure that we're all kind of on that same page here. Pardon me. So in short, exploitation does happen, and sex work is not unique in that. So something I want to consider, and this can be an opportunity to unmute if you want to kind of chat, raise your hand if you want to like offer some, or just reflect on or share with me in the chat. What are your working conditions? Just right now, what are the conditions under which you are working and exchanging labor, if you are doing labor for pay? And then consider that, and then what would those conditions be if your work was illegal? So if the work and the labor that you're doing was criminalized in some way, how would that change your conditions? How would it improve it? How would it worsen it? What would be different? So for me, my working conditions, I have a standard schedule, I have fair pay, I have like opportunity to sit and stand and walk. Those are some of my conditions. If my clients who I serve were criminalized, they wouldn't be able to come visit me in public. I wouldn't be able to reach them out. I couldn't advertise that I am supporting them. I couldn't advertise that the services that I can offer. And that would change. I could no longer probably work in an office. I would no longer be able to do outreach in the same way. I would have to get more creative with how I speak about the services I offer. That would change the conditions under which I'm working. So consider, how would anyone, yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna ask to unmute. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it okay if I answer the question?
Please do. Absolutely.
So I'm self-employed, which is good and bad. I have really shitty insurance because I live in the US. And I get to choose to say no to people, which is cool, but also because of my financial situation, I also will screw myself if I say no sometimes. So a lot of times, even though to other people it may seem like I have the total freedom to say yes, no, to whatever, and to choose, what time I work and all of that. Sometimes I don't really have a choice in that because of my financial situation.
100%.
So
100% that.
I can relate in that sense.
Yeah.
But also, I also recognize that, it's not illegal to do what I do. So I don't have to stress about meeting with, my clients and all of those things.
Yeah, 100%. I'm really glad you brought those up because, like you said, those challenges and those parts of work that kind of suck, like that can exist in sex work as well. But I don't know if I would say that you're trafficked. Maybe you are. That's not on me to decide for you. But that wouldn't be a common way to define that. It is that the need for money will constrain our choices. It'll change our choices a little bit and change the consequences of certain actions, right? And then, like you said, it's not illegal. And so if sex work, so right now, if your work was illegal and your landlord found out that you're doing this work in your home, even though you're providing this service, sorry, this is a parallel to sex work. I'm just saying, I don't know what you do, but like if a sex worker providing a service is not legal, but a client purchasing is, that means a crime is happening in an interaction with a sex worker. Something illegal is happening. Most leases state that illegal activity cannot happen on the premises. Therefore, if you're working from home, you see a client in your home, landlord finds out, in Alberta at least, I don't know about the law anywhere else, but in Alberta at least, that is grounds for eviction. You're good. And so if people who are self-employed, or imagine, like, so I was talking to someone who said, like, yeah, imagine a hairdresser. Hairdressers often have salons in their homes. If getting your hair cut by someone was illegal, if getting a haircut was illegal, what are the chances then that that person would feel safe to advertise exactly what kind of haircuts they can offer, their rates, how open can they be about their work to their neighbors, how careful do they have to be with their windows and like what they're doing, people coming in and out, how am I going to explain that? That adds an extra layer. These challenges that you experience, or like you like stated, and the goods and the bads exist in sex work as well because it's work, and the criminalization is what makes it unique. Amazing. Thank you for answering that. Anyone else? What are your working conditions? Also, sorry, feel free to raise your hand if it comes up while I'm talking, but some other questions to consider. So consider yours, and then what are the working conditions for sex workers right now? So how about reporting an unfair employer? If you were employed by someone, you work for under the direction of someone, reporting an employer for unsafe, unfair, like violent actions. Right to a safe workplace. So I have a right to a workplace that does not have falling beams and asbestos, those are rights to a safe workplace. Right to compensation, minimum wage. Again, these are going to be especially for people who are employed, because like you said, self-employment has different conditions and different things that have to be met. And so what happens, this is a quote from a lawyer who is working closely with sex worker groups in the pursuit of decriminalization. But her quote is, criminalization forces sex workers to put up with poor working conditions and incidents of violence. Criminalization has forced third parties and workplaces to conceal sex work. So sex workers can neither access decent working conditions nor report harassment or violence because their employers and peers are consequently scrutinized as third parties or human traffickers. So criminalization worsens working conditions, and then those working conditions are often used as a talking point to talk about exploitation in the sex industry. Is the point I'm making clear? Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of like rambling. I want to make sure that like this understanding of like labor, amazing. Thank you so much. And sex work is clear, is that this is not a sex work problem. Therefore, criminalizing and judging and trying to rescue sex workers is not going to solve it. This is an opportunity for solidarity across labor, across working people. So keep considering working conditions, and if you want to pop back in with working conditions, you let me know. But now, what are your labor rights? So this will be different for people who are self-employed, people who are contractors and people who are employed under an employer. There are different rights and different standards. And so what are yours? Again, what would be different if you were self-employed, if you were a contractor, and if you're employed? Pardon me. What can you do if your rights are being denied right now in your current work? Again, a lot of this conversation I'm realizing is based on the assumption that most people here are not sex workers. And so if I'm mansplaining to people who are sex workers, my apologies. However, yes, what are your labor rights? What are they? And then if you're lacking them, consider like who's in control of those rights. Pardon me, goodness gracious. Another thing to consider is who is afforded labor rights more than others. So the labor rights under like Alberta's code for people in specific industries like farming are different. The working conditions that employers are legally obligated to offer or to have are different for farming industries. And I'm sure there's a bunch of reasons for that. I'm not a farmer. I'm just speaking on my ass. However, again, who is likely to be taking those positions? When we have positions that are afforded very few rights, benefits, and such, and under an employer, there are people who, like the quote in that first slide, are in a specific socioeconomic condition. Their choices may be different. Their choices may be, again, either forego necessities of life, of food, shelter, water, or take employment that may be exploitative. And then what do you hate about your job? I would love anyone to just, what do you hate about your job? What is the worst part of your job? What are things that could change to make your job better? Alternatively, also, what might sex workers hate about their job? This is an open question. Chats or mice. If not, I'll wait a second. Someone said, I wish I could do more for my clients. Absolutely. I, in my position, am also often like, dang, I can't actually do everything I want to do, like in an ideal world. Absolutely. I hate that too. And I wonder if this creates an opportunity for burnout, right? I think burnout can often happen when we are so working to sustain certain conditions and then we still want to do more, but we can't. And so we're using what we can. Like that creates this like gunning engine spurt of energy. Someone said red tape as well. It feels very binding and restrictive for care. Absolutely. Bureaucracy, having to fill out 5 different forms to get someone basic needs feels very restrictive, very disheartening personally. I don't want to project my feelings onto you, but I feel that as well.
Someone else says feeling like I need to be available at all times.
Totally. On call 24/7. That also would be a really good parallel to sex workers because often because we don't have an idea of what etiquette is when accessing services from sex workers. We know that in a hair salon, if you want your hair dyed, you can't request a 15-minute appointment. That's not going to fly. You know that you can't probably walk in and ask for balayage. That's not going to happen. But the understanding of the etiquette for sex work is different. And so there may be a pressure. 2 a.m., bars are closed, people want to access services. Do you have to be on? Do you have to be ready? That's exhausting. Someone in the chat noted so many boundaries that restrict client access to services. Absolutely. These brick walls, and these can exist on so many levels, like individual, like micro, macro, micro, meso, macro, the whole thing. And something to consider too is that perhaps because of the criminalization of sex work, that's a boundary that also restricts clients from accessing services, right? And so if someone, for example, sex workers request ID from a client to verify age or as a screening method in case they don't pay or if something happens, that client is now experiencing a boundary to that service. And that boundary is a very fair and good boundary to set. And that creates this tension because we're in a criminalized context. If that client then is not committing a felony by accessing sex worker services, I am totally happy to give my ID at a bar. I am totally happy to give my ID to tattoo artists because I'm not doing something illegal, right? And so that is a boundary, absolutely. And I bet, you know what? Sex workers hate that about the job too.
Someone else says that they have to be available 9 to 5 instead of a focus on the actual work that they like the amount of work that they
Totally.
create.
Yes, that is a huge thing, is that people are paid for time rather than work. And so, like you might have someone and I remember working retail and being like, I'm hustling and bustling and this person's just sitting here and we're getting paid the same. And the thing is that that's not actually their fault. I am not being exploited by that person who is taking their sweet time. That is not on them. It is the way that we value work and time. And then also, then people, I'm generalizing based on like social understandings and like people who are in like corporate jobs and stuff like that. But there is this pressure to meet a certain job standard. But if you finish your job and work required in less than the time that you are being paid for, it's not like you get paid the same if you leave early, even though you got the work done. So there's an official understanding also of what work, like there seems to be an understanding of, sorry, now I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but this idea of a work shortage, right? My understanding is that work is done to support the needs of our community. Work needs to be done to continue the progression of society, to maintain the functioning of our communities, and a whole bunch of people do all kinds of work for that. So if there's a work shortage, wouldn't that mean that there is enough labor going around to support each other and to support society, and that there's more time to access passions and pleasures and recreation? But no, because we need to work to get paid. So the understanding of work to complete a task that needs to be done for the betterment of ourselves and everyone else has shifted to work needing to be done to get paid to then access these resources that we need to survive. And so great point. Absolutely. Having to be able to 9 to 5, regardless of how much work is being done. And I would assume that would also mean that self-employment can be appealing, because then you can do all the work that you need to do on your own time, blah, 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 and then comes with other costs. And so to draw to the parallel to sex work, for example, if someone is like taking a shift in a massage parlor, for example, and then that portion is being paid for, if you're an employee, you'd be paid by the hour. You'd be paid regardless of if any clients came in. When you're a contractor, people need to come and you need to serve clients. So there's differences in pay and labor and all that kind of stuff. Amazing. Anyone else on what you might hate about your job? What's the worst part of your job? Or what, even if a job that you used to have and then you don't like any, like you don't have it anymore. I put a little bit in a previous slide just as a reminder that I used to work retail. And then consider also who's benefiting from your job, the parts that you hate about your job. Why are those in place? Sometimes it's not like it's not on purpose, but who benefits from those being in place? So for example, when I worked retail, I worked retail. The CEO of that company is like, it's American Eagle, right? It's a huge company. That CEO is worth at least $1 billion. Last I checked. I was making minimum wage. The people creating the garments are making absolutely like disgusting levels of no money, essentially, right? Because they're outsourcing. So their working conditions then allow me to sell these garments for better working conditions, which then allows the CEO to create a profit. If everyone in that chain was afforded the same labor rights and afforded the same working conditions, that would take away the means by which this person could make all that money, right? And so the working conditions and the parts that we hate about our job are often are in place at times to benefit certain people. And that is the problem. That is where exploitation happens. It is not the fact that we're doing that work, is that drives the need to acquire. And so again, exploitation in work as a whole, not just sex work. Someone also said they hate the no sense of safety or support from supervisors or agency overall. 100%. So you're just hustling, bustling. People, like maybe the workplace hazards are not being addressed. You're having a bad day. You can't get support from your supervisor. Absolutely. That sounds awful. And again, like community is so important to sustaining us and to supporting us. Pardon me. And then I want to consider too that if you if your supervisor was being criminalized, sorry, back to sex work. If your supervisor was being criminalized, that was going to impact whether or not they can offer you support. Right now, what is impacting it? Right? Just consider it. There's no right or wrong answer. I don't know. I have no idea what's impacting it. It could be overwork. It could be like that they're getting paid by the hour. It doesn't matter how much work, just to tie into all of this. It could be like personal issues, whatever. And then if we add a criminalization onto it, that's going to create a whole nother level of ability to access support. So we can see that the parts of work that we all hate, or that's terrible, or the parts of our job that are actually exploitative, exist in sex work in addition to criminalization. So that adds extra stuff to it. The point here is not that sex work is uniquely exploited. It is that it is work. It is work. And so we need to shift the idea of sex work being an exploitative job to sex work is work, and work can be exploitative. Again, I don't want to say that all work is terrible and that we all hate our jobs. I love my job personally. And if I wasn't getting paid, I would not be doing the same amount of work. I would not be here every single day at like the same levels. You know what I mean? So thank you for considering that. And this will also highlight that when you have a bad day, when you have a day where you're like, I don't want to go to work, or today's a really bad day, if someone approached you and said, well, what about you change jobs? How about you just stop that job? That job is causing you so many bad days. It's exploiting you. We often take jobs because we have certain options. And sometimes we do change jobs and we do access something different when we can. But sometimes I feel like it's a common understanding that like, I can't afford to lose this job. I've got bills to pay. I am in a financial like rut. That same idea applies to sex work as well. When sex workers have a bad day, the answer to that is not to then ditch that job and find something else. You know, some people might want to. Some people might actually hate their job completely. And that doesn't make it trafficking. That doesn't make it okay to criminalize that industry. I hated retail, and it would not make any sense to criminalize retail. That just doesn't make sense. I worked my first job at Timmy's, didn't love that either. It doesn't make sense to then criminalize it. Because again, we need to survive in capitalism. Okay, so this is a bit of a ramble. I'm sorry. So this is kind of the wrap up here, the big points I want to take. So the idea behind the previous questions that I asked is to highlight again that sex work is labor, and labor is a shared idea and experience. And although labor and work is a shared idea, there are unique challenges faced by sex workers because of legislative and social barriers. Social barriers meaning like access to healthcare and access to supportive counseling and like access to compensation, all these kinds of things. Especially when we're considering self-employment, so someone who's an independent sex work, who's working on Stroll, we can then draw comparisons to artists. Clients are really mean sometimes. Clients can be so mean. And that doesn't mean that they're trafficking me, right? It could be shitty. And I don't want to minimize the harm and the real damage that can be caused by having clients who are violent or abusive. And that's not unique to sex work either. When I was working at Timmy's as a little 15-year-old, people would chuck their bagels into the cash when it wasn't made right. I'm not comparing that to different kinds of violence. However, clients are so mean sometimes. And that doesn't mean that criminalizing it would improve it. Criminalizing them does not improve it because it hasn't. It hasn't improved sex workers' working conditions. So decriminalization does not mean that the job is perfect. Decriminalizing sex work does not mean that every single sex worker is a boss babe who loves their life, CEO. It just means that we're removing the legislative barrier to certain working conditions. And then now we have the same barriers as a lot of other industries. And then we can support each other in that as well. Criminalization does not create good working conditions. It impedes on them. Criminalization is not giving anything except harm. Therefore, we need to remove it. That is kind of the idea of decriminalization. Pardon me. The other thing is some people love it, hate it, could take it or leave it. And so not just an idea that sex work is okay if the person is 100% comfortable, loves every single one of their clients, completely autonomous, makes really good money. that's an okay kind of sex work, and everything else is exploitative. Everything else is trafficking. That can sometimes be an idea that is communicated by prohibitionists, but that's not a standard that we apply to any other job. I might be mistaken. If there is, please let me know. But I can't think of another job in which that is the standard, is that if it is the perfect dream job, then it's okay in any other context. We should save you from it, right? Some people also do sex work and hate it. And that can be doing work that you hate, and especially when it's sex work, can be traumatizing, right? And it is not unique to sex work. Being forced to do work that you hate because you need to survive is a problem, just as it's a problem in a lot of jobs that impede on workers' rights. There was, I went to a sanctuary, like an animal sanctuary a couple of years ago, and the neighboring property was a slaughterhouse, which was ironic because it was like a vegan sanctuary. But anyway, she was telling, the owner was telling a story about how one of the cows that she'd received into the sanctuary was given because a man working at the slaughterhouse, his job was to slaughter the animals using like outdated and ineffective methods. Like there was one cow that he had like a specific connection with and just couldn't bear to do it. And he expressed how difficult that job was for him, how he absolutely, like, it was soul wrenching. It was everything against his values. And he did not have documentation. He was living here without documentation and could not get work that had conditions that were better for him and his environment. Again, sex work is different kind of work. And this is an issue of labor rights. So what's needed is not criminalization, it is solidarity. Again, and then some people love it. Some people love the job, and that's amazing. Amazing. But even people who love their job have bad days. And when bad days happen, we want to respond to that in a way of support rather than rescue. We don't want to rescue people from their bad days. Rescue meaning like supporting this drama triangle again. Rescue as a means of maintaining that position. Because if someone is in a role where they want to be rescuing people, they need to always have someone to rescue. Whereas when we're supporting someone and standing in solidarity with someone, this is where we're trying to improve all of our conditions together, because this is our community. This is not someone that needs saving. This is kind of the end of my spiel, the end of my little soap. Oh, shoot, sorry. Oh my goodness, I don't know how to do this. And so we have like 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, queries, feedback on whether this made any amount of sense, or whether this confirms your views on sex work, or is it going to impact the way that you talk about exploitation and trafficking in regards to sex work and all work. Any final thoughts from folks? Or any ideas of your own work, or any ideas of how we talk about like unions, or I don't know, yeah, sex work in general. Okay, well, with that, we have 5 minutes before 12. Thank you for joining. If anyone has any follow-up that they would like to do, I will stay on till 12, and there's also the addresses and phone numbers for the agency, SafeLink Alberta. And yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Hope your knowledge has been quenched. I feel like I should sing a little exit song. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. Ba, 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 ba. Thank you. Got a comment. I think it's good to talk about how exploitative any kind of work can be. Thank you. I agree. Because again, sometimes I think about the arguments that prohibitionists are making, and I'm like, you're so close. There's something so close in this, but it's not quite given the energy in the right direction.
Nicole, someone else said it confirmed their view.
Yay! That's awesome. Heck yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.